Our keynote speaker for lunch this morning, we're excited to have. I had the chance to meet him for a little bit. It made me laugh a lot. But one of the cool things about him, I did not know this, he played for the Stampeders for 3 years, if you like that. Or don't. Well, there you go. Thank you. And he did want me to mention that he did play 1 year in Winnipeg. Huh. Winnipeg is in the house. I love it. That is amazing. Dan Wicklum is the CEO of Transition Accelerator. He's going to be sharing a message on net zero changes everything. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a warm welcome for Dan Wicklum.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chestnut. I would say go Stamps. Or go Bombers, depending on where you're from. But I would just have to say, I played from 1871 to 1873, I think it was. But we did win back then, which is also a bit of a difference between the current team. That's another whole story. So I have about half an hour to give a truncation of a 2-day course that we give. So there's going to be a little bit of leaps of logic in there, but you're a very informed audience, so I think we will be able to pull it off. I will be answering questions at the end, briefly, maybe five or 6 minutes of questions. So, I'm here to talk about net zero changes everything. We have an organization called the Transition Accelerator that we launched 4 years ago. I left something called the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, COSIA, that I launched and ran for 7 years, but I left that to set up the Transition Accelerator. We now have about 50 employees coast to coast from basically British Columbia, Vancouver to St. John's, Newfoundland. And what we do is we try to occupy the interstitial space between industry, government, academia, and civil society interests to take the best of all of those, but leave the restrictions and the difficulties behind. And we do really one thing. We help put in place stepwise pathways to futures that are economically competitive, but also compatible with a net zero world. That's what we do. We have a difficult time sort of categorizing ourselves. We're certainly not an environmental group. We're not a think tank. We're not academic. We're sort of, again, a new organization with a new methodology in this interstitial space. So what I'm going to talk about, again, is a topic of one of our courses. I'm going to give a blatant advertisement at the end on a couple of the other things that we do that if you're interested, you can mesh in directly with us. But what I'm setting out to achieve during this talk is this objective of developing a deeper understanding of the pathways to net zero emissions, the theory, the trends, the policies, and the next steps. And just as a little bit of a setup, remember, we've been talking about emissions since 1992. That's when the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was signed by all the participating countries, 1992. That's a UN treaty, and if you know how the UN works, that was actually, 1992 was after 4 years of negotiation and after 5 years of scientific inquiry. So this is actually since about 1982 that scientists have been telling us we're not going to like the world unless we act on climate change, like we act on emissions reduction. So, but we've all dithered. The whole world is dithered. And we went from reducing emissions, we were in an emissions reduction paradigm, think Kyoto Accord, think Copenhagen, and now we've left it so long, we've lost that window. We can't just reduce emissions, we have to eliminate emissions in a net zero definition. And what our organization was launched for, the Transition Accelerator, was really to think much, much more deeply about what are the actual real differences between an emissions reduction paradigm and an emissions elimination paradigm. So that's what I want to talk to you about here today. I think whenever I give these talks, I really always want to ground back into like, why are we doing this? We're going through the largest change management exercise in the history of the planet. We're completely retooling all of our economies globally. We better be really clear why we're doing this. So, why take action? The concept of net zero changes everything. I want to introduce a couple of concepts that we think are critical in this conceptual shift from reduction to elimination. And one is this notion of a dead-end pathway. We argue that the current tools are sufficient as well. The risk frameworks, the analytical models, the incentive packages set up by all of our employers. So the current tools are sufficient to reduce emissions. Now, goal 2, emissions elimination, we have to focus on absolute emissions. It's not about how efficient you get. We must reduce the absolute amount of emissions that's going into the atmosphere, or why the heck are we doing this? This is a weird one. I'll follow it up on the next slide. There's actually very few options to eliminate emissions. Lots of ways to reduce them, very few ways to eliminate them. I'll come back to that. because actually you need to fundamentally change the system. So think of what we're doing with the passenger vehicles. There's all kinds of debates over sort of availability of critical minerals and cost and so on and so forth, but there's not a single credible government, not a single credible analysis anywhere in the world that says we can get to net zero emissions and still keep the fossil internal combustion engine on the road. Not one. That's why basically every government, certainly the G20, is coming out with zero-emission vehicle mandates. They're basically saying, like, we can't change this unless we force the system to change. And the only way to do that is with a reg. So they're bringing out zero-emission vehicle mandates. And we see that working through the system over the course of probably 15 years. Incremental change won't yield new systems. So over on the left side there, if we wanted to incrementally change the efficiency of the internal combustion engine, we can do that. In fact, car manufacturers have been fantastic at that, making the engine more efficient over time. But if you accept the idea that we're just going to make the internal combustion engine more efficient, a brand new system of zero-emission vehicles will never emerge. Because at some point, you're actually going to get to the point where you just can't make them any more efficient. So you have to start with retooling into fundamentally new systems. And that's what the world's doing. And our current tools, we just think they're not sufficient. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Okay, boy, I feel like I'm talking super fast here, and I talk fast to begin with, but I want to introduce a concept called dead-end pathways. I've got this goofy cartoon here, and we've got this little hiker here. She's got her backpack on, and she's going to go for a hike. And the objective of that hiker is to get to the top, a high elevation, get to the top of that peak over there. That's actually the net zero target. So she's got two paths that she could take here. She could take the red one, or she could take the green one. The red one looks really, really interesting and seductive, because what it says is that she's gaining a lot of elevation right away. So what that means is she's actually reducing emissions really, really quickly. The problem is if she takes this red pathway, she'll eventually get to the top of a false target. She'll get to a point where she can't go any higher. So what she got to do, she's got to take the damn path down again, start again, and take a path that's more difficult, maybe even slower, but it's actually truly capable and compelling to get to the actual true target, which is net zero. So this concept of dead-end pathways, if you transfer that from the cartoon to the real world, what does that mean? Well, here are some examples. Liquefied natural gas, or even just compressed natural gas for heavy-duty vehicles. You cannot get a zero-emission heavy transportation system if you use natural gas for it. But wow, if you did it right now, you'd reduce your emissions probably by 40%. Super seductive. One of the issues when you have a problem, first step in trying to address the problem, stop making it bigger. So why are we still allowing houses to be built with fossil heating systems? That's a real question. Very difficult for national governments to put in place bylaws, but I'll tell you, the Vancouver, City of Toronto, and New York all have bylaws that de facto, in the immediate future, will make it illegal to put in fossil heating systems into those jurisdictions. And the laundry list of municipalities and counties and subnational governments that are putting that in place is actually quite remarkable. So this change is happening, sometimes at the national level, sometimes at the subnational level. Ethanol blended with gasoline as fuel for cars. This may sound weird, but we're actually not fans of this. This is the concept of a clean fuel standard that requires companies to reduce the carbon intensities of their gasoline or diesel is a dated policy tool, we believe, was put in place an emissions reduction paradigm when the objective was to reduce emissions. And we're forcing massive amounts of private investment into the system to reduce the carbon intensity of gasoline and diesel when it's a dead-end pathway. We're going to have to change completely the internal combustion engine. That's why, even at this point, some of the car manufacturers are now arguing against that clean fuel standard and saying we're all in on EVs. Okay, so this is actually more of a geeky slide than the other one. So I'm going to try to unpack this a little bit. Net zero changes everything. What this slide is our existing energy system with real data from, I thought so, real data from Natural Resources Canada. So it's real data from Natural Resources Canada. So you can see dominated by fossil fuels, natural gas, gasoline, diesel, so on. Some electricity, some biomass, but that's real data. It's about 5 years dated now, but it's not going to change dramatically. Okay, so this is where I'm trying to hammer home that point. There are many ways to reduce emissions, but few systems can actually be functional in net zero. So what does that mean? Like, if you just try to get more efficient on that system, fossil fuels will never go away. So there's a remarkable, strong consensus emerging around the world that we have to fundamentally change our paradigm, what we're trying to do. We're not trying to incrementally change our existing system. What we have to do is start in the future, define what a net zero energy system could be, and then build a pathway to it. So it sounds weird, and people are saying, well, you're freaking crazy, you can't do that. Well, you can, and people are. So the unbelievable consensus around the world, in the G20 countries at least, that this is what the future energy system is going to look like. And we can debate the size of the pies and all this stuff, but the bottom line is there's not a country in the world does not feel that we have to have massive electrification. Every single country understands that. But electricity has its limitations. For example, you can't move heavy things around the landscape with electricity right now. So there's not a single company in the world that we know of that is going to electric trains, for example. Every single one of them is going to hydrogen. It's difficult to move ships, trains, heavy trucks, like big, huge Class 8 trucks. Basically, the whole world is going to hydrogen. So hydrogen could be an energy carrier. You can make hydrogen from electricity and electrolysis, or you could upgrade natural gas. And my organization feels very, very strongly we should be doing everything we possibly can to get value out of our fossil fuel resources so we can use them permanently, but in a way that is truly net zero. So we're huge fans of taking natural gas, upgrading it into hydrogen, and you can do that in extremely low carbon intensity, and using hydrogen as the fuel of the future. The point here is that this system on the right will never emerge if you try to change the system on the left incrementally. You have to define the future and build a pathway to it. Let me give you the best example I know. There's an initiative in Europe called the Hydrogen Backbone Project. 55 organizations, mostly pipeline companies and big energy companies, are defining the continental hydrogen pipeline distribution system they need in order to get the continent of Europe to net zero. So they're literally, think about it in Canada, do you think we would be able to define the continental, or at least, or even national, hydrogen pipeline distribution system in order to get to net zero? We're so far away from that, it's ridiculous, but the continent of Europe is doing it. So that's the best example that I know of a very difficult, complicated political jurisdictions collectively defining a future system and then building a pathway to it. So, bang home the point, incremental changes won't result in net zero systems, we got to define them. And need to define future systems and then build a pathway to them. So this sounds simple, but wow, what a conceptual change in terms of the role of industry, the role of government, how we're trained, the tools that we have. So this is, we think there's a huge difference between reducing emissions and eliminating emissions. Okay, here's, thought you'd get away without doing any homework. Where does Canada rank among other G7 countries in terms of emissions reductions? This is the pregnant pause.
Per capita, it's one of the worst.
Per capita, one of the worst. Anyway, look, we'll jump into it here. Here it is. I gotta tell you, this is actually slightly dated, but the trends are exactly the same. So for me, the point is, Canada's at the top. Again, to 2022, we have increased our emissions. To me, the point is, economies that are somewhat similar to ours, like these are big, sophisticated G7 economies, take a look at what they've done. They've done a remarkable job in actually reducing their emissions, including the United States of America. Look, we've got inherent disadvantages. We're big, we're cold, we've got an oil and gas sector, we get all that. But the bottom line is that we can't give ourselves the luxury to say the other countries aren't trying harder, aren't trying and aren't getting results. They are. That's the backdrop within which we find ourselves competing. And those countries are actually making decisions right now about what types of energy they're going to import. So Japan is sourcing the world as we speak for clean sources of, massive amounts of clean sources of hydrogen that they need to get to 2050. So these countries are making decisions. Look, what about sectors? Again, this is dated. This is now, it's a bit difficult with data because in Canada, when we collect data, we report it 2 years later. In the UK, when they collect data, they report it 6 months later. So we're actually always with this goofy 2-year time lag around on trying to understand whether what we're trying to do, our policy prescriptions, are like whether they're working or not. The Government of Canada knows that and they're working on it, but so far we've got about a two-year time lag. So this is not 2 years old, it's about 18 months old, these data you got right here. So So again, I'm not going to go into the details here, but you can take a look at where our emissions come from, and they come predominantly from oil and gas, agriculture, transport, and buildings. Other stuff is actually really, really minor. So people take a look at heavy industry. Well, it's actually a relatively minor source of emissions, and they've actually been doing a reasonable job of decreasing it. The three that are de facto increasing, oil and gas by far is the worst. Despite what you might hear from proponents, oil and gas emissions is going up. It's not going down. Oil and gas emissions are going up, especially in Alberta, especially in the oil sands. So all of the things that you hear from the Pathways Alliance and so on about, don't worry, we'll get to 2050, their emissions are going up. Simple, end of story, undebatable, with the data that they report to the Government of Canada. I'd be happy to debate anyone on stage about that, but so far they have not taken up my invitation. Okay. Now I'm going to get into this notion of institutional landscape. Like, if this is this important to us, we've got to make sure that we're taking a really, really deliberate approach to this, okay? So we have an act. Most of the G20 countries either have or are putting in place a law that requires the country to get to net zero emissions. This is the act. It legally requires the setting of 5-year emission targets. It legally requires the setting of a plan, reporting on progress against the plan. Our 2030 target is 40 to 45% below 25 levels. This was set in the middle of the last election. The first update report, actually we'll come back to it in a minute, but there are accountability measures, annual reporting, audits, and there's a net zero advisory body, a formal legal body appointed by cabinet to advise the government on this. I chaired that body for the first 3 years. Just stepped down a couple months ago. So we have an act, requires us to act, and we have a plan. So the plan was put out 2 years ago. The first annual update report was put out in the fall. Basically, an assessment of all of the things that we're doing. Does that put us on a trajectory to meet our target, yes or no? The target is 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. I'm not going to go into detail. If you want more than this, we can either talk or we have our course or so on. But the way the plan works, it basically takes a look at all the sectors and says, what is it reasonable to ask each sector to decrease their emissions by 2030? It doesn't say everyone's got to decrease their emissions by the same amount. In fact, just the opposite. It actually asks some sectors to work much, much harder than others. The update came out and it said we're likely on track to reduce our emissions by 2030 by 34%, not 40. I just got to tell you, I actually feel pretty good about that. So all we ever hear about is missing targets, don't have a plan. Not true, well, somewhat true, not true. We've got a plan. And the first thing, if you actually want to make progress, come up with a plan, institute it, and then adjust. And that's what in this country has been doing for the last 2 years. So I'm not going into the details here, but this is the amount of reductions that are required in the plan by each sector. The electricity sector, which is one of the cleanest in the world already, is being asked to reduce their emissions by a further 88% by 2030. This is the clean electricity reg that you see all the battles going on between the Prime Minister and our Premier. But the electricity sector is being asked to do the heavy lifting. Heavy industry is being asked, so this is steel, cement, fertilizer. They're being asked to reduce their emissions by 39%. Buildings by 37, oil and gas by 31. We sort of get this impression in Alberta that, like, boy, oh boy, the Government of Canada is just putting it to the oil and gas sector. Well, if that's true, they're putting it to the other sectors a whole lot more than putting it to the oil and gas sector. Transportation by 11%. Again, I'm not going to go into detail into this here, but these are like essentially the major instruments that the Government of Canada is using in their role. I'm not going into the provinces, it just gets too complicated, to force these things. So electricity, clean electricity regs by 2035 to get a right-sized net zero 2050. The Net Zero Advisory Body that I chaired advised the government to allow some provinces, especially Alberta, much, much more flexibility than they put out in the draft plan. I'm pretty sure the government's going to listen to that advice. Heavy industry, there's investment tax credits, there's the carbon tax, there's now something called carbon contracts for differences. Buildings, there's a strategy, retrofits. Oil and gas, this is the methane regs. This is the one that's really contentious here, right? Methane regulations, emissions cap, investment tax credits, and that will certainly go to the Supreme Court to figure out whether or not the federal government has jurisdiction and the ability to do this or not. Transport basically is zero-emission vehicle mandates, like most of the other countries. Okay, I've got about, where am I here? Yeah. I'm going to blast through these last slides. I want to talk about the concept of transition. Everyone hears about it. Transition this, transition that. When we launched our organization, the first thing we did is we took a look at, like, what can we learn about transitions? How did they happen in the past? What did they look like? How many of them were there? And can we draw some generalizations that's going to allow us to use that as a tool to position Canada and make progress? So as it turns out, there's an extremely predictable pattern of transitions. Every single one. There's often a slow adoption of something, an approach, a business model, a technology. That slow adoption, this is sort of the right down in the crux of the XY axis there, that almost horizontal line. That can be decades. Then all of a sudden something happens. There's a leadership change, there's maybe a policy regulation change, there's more comfort with the technology, and then things go almost vertical. There's this sort of phase of extremely quick change, and then the last little bit takes a long time as well, for lots of different reasons. So you can take this just conceptually, you can take my word for it, or you can take a look at this. So, this is not completely analogous to what we're talking about here, but it's so cool, right? Like, I mean, take a look, from 1900 right back to the telephone, to electricity. Generally, there's this really slow period, but some of it takes an awful long time. So even with the smartphone here, like, before it started to go vertical, there's like 8 years. And we think that this type of revolution happens overnight. It just doesn't. So there's this general S-curve. So when we take a look at things like what's happening on the electric vehicle adoption, people will say, well, it'll never happen. They've been trying to do this for 10 years, so slow and so, well, it's expected. It's 100% expected. If you map the shape of the transition against the shape of every single other transition. But we're almost going vertical. Now look, there's always going to be hiccups. Things are slowing down in the States. They're speeding up in Quebec and so on. But in some jurisdictions, some states, 25% of the new vehicles are electric vehicles. All right. I've just been given the 5-minute sign by Mr. Chestnut, so. So this is what our organization does. We actually put in pathways and we think deeply about, like, where are we and where do we want to go? And that's not generically like net zero 2050. It's like, what's the system configuration that we need? So one thing we're coming out with about a month is the minimum viable corridor for hydrogen use in heavy vehicles. People want to put a pilot project in with one truck. We're thinking nifty. How many fueling stations of what size, servicing how many trucks of what size, going what distances do you need to make the economics work? So without defining that future system, we'll be continuously stuck in the small little problem definitions and solutions. So that notion of define what the future system needs and then build a pathway to it. Okay, I'm going to blast through this. Here's another one, absolute core tenet I'd like you to think about, and that is, we have dead-end pathways. We know what they are. We can debate them. But there's more certainty than uncertainty what we need to do. And one of the things that we always hear is, like, we don't know what to do. We can't pick winners and losers. Like, how do you do this? There's too many options, da, da, da. We think it's all baloney. You just need to get a little bit analytical. So we have come up with this report called a Decision Support Tool. Did it 2 years ago. We're updating it now. We're actually working with the province of BC, Alberta, and Ontario to make regionally specific ones. Let me show you what this is. It basically, this is complex, don't worry about the details, I'll talk through it. It basically says, look, if you're at the very top, what are our options to completely decarbonize heavy vehicles? Think Class 8 trucks, those big monster things that run you over on the freeways, right? So what we have on the rows here is every single option that someone credible has put forward to say, this is an option to decarbonize heavy vehicles. So we've got hydrogen fuel cells, the top row. We've got a couple types of batteries, like catenary is like with an overhead wire. You've got biodiesel. Actually go forward here. You've got compressed or liquefied natural gas, renewable natural gas, synthetic natural gas. There's only so many ways you can actually move a truck around the landscape, and they're basically defined right here. Then we've just come up with criteria. So, and these are the columns. So is the technology mature? It's actually freaking work. It's great to have an idea. Does it work? What's the economic viability? What's the social acceptability? It's great to have an idea, but if people are not going to allow you to use that idea, it doesn't matter. Fit for purpose, net zero pathway potential. This is a key one. Can it actually be part of a net zero system future? Is how critical it is to the stakeholders. Related costs and benefits. This one I like on the right-hand side here. Like, if we're going through this change, let's try to make as much money as we possibly can. So what are the economic development opportunities? And then we basically get experts, consult heavily with industry, do lots of analysis behind each of these cells, but then we put a stoplight color to it. Red is not going to work. You can debate all you want, not going to work. Green is, we think it can work right now. And differentiations of green and yellow are sort of somewhere in the middle, right? We need more attention to it. Might work, not sure. Not sure now, but if we actually fix some of these things, it will work. So you see, like, there are ways we think that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles could work, battery electric, catenary, some biodiesel, but none of these have reds. But when you take a look at compressed or liquefied natural gas, there's a red because there's no way you can move a truck around the landscape and have no emissions if you're running it on liquefied or compressed natural gas. Simple as that. So frankly, this should not be pursued by public policy. Private sector can do whatever the heck it want, but government should be putting any money into this, in our humble opinion. I'm gonna roll through this. Okay, look, I'll put this together for Alberta. The elephant in the room is the oil and gas sector, right? Look, it's still critical, no one's debating that, but it is the problem. It's the problem, combusting oil and gas, where emissions go into the atmosphere. Here's a really interesting one. The latest IEA, this is the International Energy Agency, shows that just with existing policies, just things that countries are doing right now, their prediction is that all fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, coal, will peak in use by the end of 2030, and then there will be a decline. What pace, no one knows. But this is the independent entity that our governments helped set up 20 years ago and has been the trusted source of analytics in the oil and gas space. And now it's telling us something very, very different that maybe we don't want to hear, but this is what it's saying. Another thing I want to tell you here, and then I'm going to maybe take up one question, is our oil and gas companies are actually not morphing into energy companies. We heard that for an awful long time. When I ran COSI, we heard that all the time. But the shareholders and the boards of the oil and gas companies, especially I know the oil sands companies best, they're basically being told, make as much money as you possibly can out of oil sands. They're not investing in hydrogen, they're not investing in electricity. In fact, they're divesting from all of that. So I think, I don't mean to say this to be hard on them, but why do we think that they are going to leave this revolution? They're making so much money now that it's the most profitable business model in the history of Confederation. This is why I actually have to regulate. Companies will remain regulatory compliant. They will never do more than they have to in order to maintain regulatory compliant. That's just, there's not a scrap of evidence to suggest otherwise. So, takeaways, there's more certainty than uncertainty. The pathways to get to net zero won't be easy, but they're clear. They're not easy, but they're actually clearer than we think there is. More certainty than uncertainty. Avoid dead-end pathways. Emissions eliminations, not reductions. And I think all parties have a responsibility to position workers for the future. So let me just talk for 1 minute on that. And that is, so if you're wondering how to position yourself or your company for the future, there are tools. Think of that stoplight diagram about what the future is going to look like, what technologies are going to prevail, and how can you position yourself and your organization to compete in that future. And I'll just say, look, we have some courses. We've got webinars all the time. You can find this up on our website. We've actually got, I think, a really nifty forum coming up in Toronto for two days. Love to have any of you there. Mr. Cheston, I'm done. Apologies for talking so fast, but I hope at least it wasn't informative, maybe it was a bit entertaining. So, thank you.